The next session is looking at environmental challenges and how they are impacting our supply chains or have impacted our supply chains. And our chair is Hedley Auld, who is no stranger to the Fields on Wheels and a friend for many years, who's helped us in organizing this and a chair as well. So we are maybe a few minutes early, but I don't think anybody's going to complain if we move forward at this point. So Hedley, over to you.
That's great, Barry. I think, shall we just continue with our program right through here without taking a break?
I think so, and we'll have maybe a little longer break if we finish up early for everybody to go and grab a peanut butter sandwich or something for lunch.
That's great. That's great. Well, we've got the theme of the next panel is indeed weather extremes and infrastructure. And I'm just going to read from the program, Barry, that we prepared. The exposure of transportation systems to weather disruptions increases with advancing climate change. Heat waves, droughts, and floods can slow or delay transport. More dramatic weather phenomena like atmospheric rivers and hurricanes can destroy infrastructure that can take weeks or months to rebuild. Now, weather extremes are difficult to anticipate and prepare for, but more change seems inevitable. Today, we have two presenters on weather extremes and infrastructure. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to strive for between 20 and 30 minutes, which will leave us some time for questions after both of their presentations. We'll, just as Mark did, I'd invite audience member to submit their questions through the chat room, and I'll queue them up for the speakers during the Q&A session that will immediately follow their presentations. 1 year ago, David Phillips, the senior climatologist at Environment Canada, released his annual year-end list of Canada's top 10 weather stories. And in December 2021, when he was reviewing the weather extremes of 2021, David admitted that he ran out of superlatives in dealing with that year's events. Words like the deadliest, the most destructive, and the most expensive. Now, in his list, the #1 story of 2021 was record temperatures under the heat dome. You'll recall the extreme and persistent heat in June and July 2021, which left, he estimated, 600 dead in BC and 200 in Alberta. It triggered wildfires, including the one that burned Lytton, BC to the ground and made worldwide news. The #2 story was BC's flood of floods. You'll remember the series of atmospheric rivers that began in September and their cumulative effect. In November 2021, the flooding in BC's lower mainland that became Canada's most disruptive and expensive natural disaster ever. And then #3 was back-to-back droughts in Western Canada, the worst crop failures in over 20 years. David concluded there is no vaccine for extreme weather. So the topic for our first speaker is atmospheric weather, rivers, and rail infrastructure. And our speaker is Greg Hamilton, who is the CN's Senior Manager of Investor Relations at its Montreal headquarters, a position that he has held for since 2021. Greg was educated at McGill, where he earned a BCom and a certificate in accounting and an MBA, and he's a registered CPA. Since 1995, he's worked in many financial areas at CN, including financial reporting and cost accounting, financial planning, business development, and mergers and acquisitions. Greg is also qualified as a conductor and has worked in mainline and yard service. In October 2016, you might recall, he was working with CN's corporate development group in Vancouver. Greg came to Winnipeg and made a presentation at the 21st Fields on Wheels conference. So we're very fortunate to have him back again today at the 27th Fields on Wheels conference. So Greg, welcome. I'm going to turn the microphone over to you now.
Well, look, Hedley, it's a real pleasure. Thank you very much for the introduction. Barry, thank you for the invitation. Obviously, since David Shudnovik's regrets, he was lined up to be the speaker today, and he asked me to kind of pitch in for him. It's a busy time of year in grain. Well, all year is busy in grain, but particularly now. And David unfortunately was triple booked for this morning, so he asked me to come and join you, which very pleased to be here. So thank you very much for having me and having CN at the event again this year, Barry. So yeah, look, we will be speaking on the atmospheric river and rail infrastructures. Just an overview of kind of where I'd like to, there we go. Kind of take us this morning briefly in my time is, just start with an overview of the company for those not familiar with CN. And then just a little bit of time talking about investment, our perspective and approach to investment. And then we'll talk about the event last year, the rain event in particular. We'll start by looking at how rail operates through British Columbia and why that's important to understand. And then we'll kind of go through the event. And then we'll end looking as a result of this event on how we can build in the future with network and infrastructure resiliency in mind. So that's kind of the plan of attack. And we'll just start here with a brief overview. So CN, as many of you I'm sure know, we are one of the backbones of the North American economy. We do enable trade coast to coast to coast. The slide in front of you now has some pertinent data as at the end of 2021. And look, 2022 has been a really exciting year. We've been on a real journey. We have a new CEO, Tracy Robinson, joined just at the end of May 2022. And, as we exited winter last year, which was a particularly difficult winter for operations, our operations improved coming out of winter, but then through the second and the third quarter of this year, we've experienced continued improvement on the operation side. So, a lot of that attributable to the leadership under Tracy. So we're really quite excited coming into 2023 next year. Here's a view of the network that we do have. Look, we're very proud of this network. It's been accumulated over the last 20-25 years through acquisitions. We've gone from being largely a Canadian network to a true North American player, and really, diverse book of business, diverse commodities. We serve through the west, the east, through the south. The west, though, in particular for us is very important to our operation. About half of our GTMs, 60% of our GTMs do operate in Western Canada, and a big part of that is grain. So grain is very important to us as a commodity, and we understand our place in the grain supply chain. So now a few minutes just on investment. We do apply a very disciplined approach to capital investment at CN. It's a capital intensive environment. And, if we're going to look at this weather extremes topic and the infrastructure associated with it, it's best to start with how do we approach investment and infrastructure at CN. Look, the underlying drivers of our investment in this infrastructure are going to be driven by safety, by improving the efficiency and fluidity of the network, and by enabling growth. across all commodities. Now, the CN's historical level of capital intensity of about 20% of revenue was a bit higher in 2018, 2019, as you can see by the graph there. And that was just, you know, there was a need to bring some additional capacity, particularly in Western Canada. And the next slide, we'll see some of the benefits of that. Yeah. And so coming into 2022 now, we've reduced our capital intensity to more of a 17% range. And look, understand that a lot of that is a more focused and disciplined maintenance program. It does not jeopardize the safety or fluidity of the network in any way. A lot of that benefit is actually achieved through our ATIP program, the Autonomous Track Inspection Program. And I'll get to a slide on that in a couple minutes. But suffice it to say that with better information, we're able to do a more targeted and robust capital program on the maintenance side. So as I mentioned, we have done a lot of capacity enhancements in the Western Corridor. You know, approximately 60% of our total capital envelope is in basic, but the balance is for rolling stock and capacity enhancements. And here you can see, you know, over the last, call it 5-6 years, we've done a number of siding projects. So if you can imagine the rail network, it's largely single track. So trains going in both directions. So when they meet, you know, you've got to have the infrastructure in place to allow for that passage. And so that'll happen at sidings. And as traffic continues to increase, particularly in the West, we have added more sidings, and we've lengthened a lot of the sidings to allow for longer trains as well. And in a lot of cases, we've actually just double tracked some of the corridors, so to allow east-west passage at the same time, over 150 miles of double track in the last number of years. And look, we continue to make these investments year in and year out. In 2022, we've got about 27 miles, 3 separate sections of double track that we've brought into service, just largely west of Edmonton, which will then provide benefits both to the Vancouver and the Prince Rupert corridors. Some siding projects as well. We've got you know, an additional siding in the Vancouver corridor, 3 sidings serving the Rupert corridor as well as some line upgrades right in the Prairie section there in Humboldt, between Humboldt and Melfort. And as I said, so the top picture there is in fact one of those ATIP cars, the Autonomous Track Inspection Program cars, and we're able to actually improve the overall resiliency of the network through technologies like ATIP or, you know, the acoustic bearing detectors, using technology to really advance the program of the company. Now, it would be a real mistake to think that rail is sort of the century-old, you know, steel wheel on steel rail, and we haven't come a long way. In fact, there's a lot of technology on the locomotives themselves that go to improve the efficiency of the overall operation. Some technology to improve the you know, the fuel consumption, which then has benefits on the environment in terms of emissions. But as I say, again, a lot of it is really pointed towards improving the safety, reliability, and ultimately the resilience of the network. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention to British Columbia and how the network actually operates, so that we can understand the importance of British Columbia to both our network and to the national economy. So this is just a little schematic here on the screen. On the bottom left of it would be where Vancouver is located, and then coming from the top right of there would be, you know, Jasper and Edmonton beyond. And so, you know, lines 1, 2, and 3 are that main line corridor running from ultimately from Edmonton down to Vancouver, and that line 10 running north of Vancouver, that's the former BC Rail, which runs between North Vancouver and Prince George. Look, very, very important aspect of our network. Approximately 40% of all CN carloads will touch British Columbia, so very, integral to our network. Much of that lower mainland, kind of down there west of Kamloops and then north of Vancouver up to Lillooet, is very mountainous terrain, as I'm sure you're well aware. It's challenging operating conditions. It's just challenging terrain. Up in the north, we've got Prince Rupert, a multi-commodity, lots of commodities in and out of there. Obviously, grain plays an important role with PRG, and about 12% of all CN carloads touch Rupert. Down in the lower mainland, Vancouver, about 25% of CN carloads are touching there, accessing over 25 different terminals throughout the lower mainland. So how do we get in and out of Vancouver? We on the main line, we operate what's called the directional running zone, the DRZ. So as you can appreciate, running through the Fraser Canyon, you basically have a rail line on the side of a mountain. So there's not a lot of opportunity to put in some of these sidings or some of the double track to be able to increase capacity. So operating agreement with CP, between CN and CP, starting about 20 years ago, was we run this section between Coho-Nipa up in the northeast and down to Page and Mission in the lower mainland. We operate this bidirectionally. So all westbound traffic, be it CN or CP, will run on CP, and all eastbound traffic, again, whether CN or CP, will run on the CP network. And so in doing that, you're leveraging both networks and basically creating a section of double track. So greatly improving the capacity in this otherwise capacity constrained corridor. And it also builds in resilience into the operation. So in the event that one line is down, there are operating agreements that both carriers can operate on the other one that is not out of service at that point. So some built-in resiliency into the network just in the way that we operate the canyon. As we get into the lower mainland itself, into Vancouver, further operating agreements attempt to address this otherwise capacity constrained environment by operating what we call the co-production agreement. And this is where through routing protocols, we assess the optimal route. So as you know, CN's network extends and reaches up to the north shore of the Burrard Inlet, whereas CP has direct access to the south shore of the Burrard Inlet. So for CP traffic that needs to go to the north shore, in a lot of cases, it makes sense for that to continue once it comes through the DRZ and hits Mission Page, to continue on the CN network so that it's got a straight shot into the north shore, as opposed to going into the CP yard and then requiring an interchange. But then it requires more locomotives, more crews, additional infrastructure, and then just ultimately eats up some capacity. So this is, again, through agreement, a way of expanding the capacity within the Greater Vancouver terminal. And this final map, again, of Vancouver is just to kind of demonstrate the complexity and the multi-user nature of the Vancouver infrastructure. You've got the two bridges and the one tunnel, which really govern the capacity. In particular, that Fraser River Bridge there, just right beside Surrey. All freight and all passenger operations will transit that bridge. I mean, it's somewhere in the order of 40 trains a day. So careful planning and awareness of that. As well, accessing the North Shore, you've got the second narrowest bridge, which is the lift span bridge, which is immediately preceded by a 2-mile tunnel. And the tunnel requires time between trains going through it to vent the noxious fumes. So again, these are some of the limitations on the ability to push additional volumes through Vancouver, just some of the capacity limitations in Vancouver. And certainly, aware of that, we've gone and actually partnered with the federal government to address some of these bottleneck issues, in particular in Vancouver. Just draw your attention, that tunnel that I spoke about, the Thornton Tunnel. They installed some additional ventilation, some fans that would then clear the air in a much more rapid fashion to allow the next train to transit more quickly. So that just creates additional capacity to access the North Shore. Similarly, a 18,900 foot siding just before the tunnel allows trains to stage so that the next available window through the tunnel, you're right on top of it and you can access it right away, rather than leading off from Thornton Yard, which is about an hour and a half away by rail. So again, lots of ability to continue to address and continually improve and tackle some of those capacity issues in the Lower Mainland in particular. So with a good understanding, or at least a quick understanding of the Lower Mainland's rail operation, let's turn our attention to what did happen last November with the rain event. So many areas in southern British Columbia received close to a month's worth of precipitation in a very short period of time, right there, November 13th and 14th. And you can see by this map the concentration of rain. I mean, it's particularly right there in the valley, but certainly going up into the canyon as well. It was significant in amount of rain. Some of the stats, you can see that a lot of locations in the Lower Mainland received multiples of an average amount of rainfall. So just completely overwhelming what was already a saturated environment because there had been a lot of precipitation into the fall, September and October already. And this followed, as Hedley mentioned, a very dry summer where we had experienced forest fires up and down the canyon. Tragically with the town of Lytton being struck. We lost a bridge as well. We were out for a couple of weeks during the summer. But the impact on the overall vegetation was through the forest fires, there's less vegetation. So once struck by significant rain, there's just fewer trees, less grass on the ground to absorb that rainfall. And that just exacerbated the situation. So then on the 13th and 14th of November, it resulted in dozens of washouts and mudslides on the CN main line between Kamloops and Vancouver. And there was multiple washouts on that Squamish section, so north of North Vancouver on the way to Prince George on the former BCR line as well. CP's main line along the corridor was also affected. And so understanding that through the DRZ, we're able to operate on each other's network in the event of an outage. When both lines are out, then it becomes situation critical for Vancouver, for the Lower Mainland. So all told, CN had 58 outages over a 150-mile stretch in the middle of November. Now, CN's main line to Prince Rupert was not affected by the heavy rains and was in service throughout the entire disruption in the southern region. So many customers were actually able to divert the traffic towards Prince Rupert at that time. So now we're just going to see some of the pictures and some of the actual the result of the devastation of these events. Looking at some of these pictures, and certainly when I saw them back last November, the thought that comes to mind is this is going to take a long time, months perhaps, to resolve. And it's important to remember that section between Kamloops and Vancouver. So Ashcroft is the northern subdivision and the Yale is the southern. The Ashcroft subdivision is much more remote than the Yale, more mountainous, more challenging terrain. And so when the highway network in BC, it also sustained a lot of damage. Well, that restricted CN's ability to reach the impacted areas on the rail network. So what we did is we worked our way south from Kamloops and we worked our way north from Vancouver to sequentially deal with each of the outages as we got to them. Now, right in the Lower Mainland in the Fraser Valley, that was also greatly impacted. And the Fraser Valley, it's the heart of agricultural production in southern British Columbia. It's got a large livestock operation, feed mills that produce feed for farms. Chilliwack is home to Rogers Food, their main wheat milling operation in BC, and they produce flour and cereal products for British Columbia and Alberta. So, significant, lots of significant damage and hardship in the Lower Mainland as well. And so here, this is the Ashcroft sub, mile 101. And you can see that we got to work, and we got to work very quickly. We had over 110 pieces of heavy equipment. We were working 24/7 to get the line back into service. We had over 400 employees and contractors that responded to the outage. All told, nearly 300,000 cubic yards of rock and earth and backfill materials were moved to rebuild these damaged locations. David gave me the stats. It's equivalent to about 25,000 truckloads of earth that we had to move. And a lot of it was obviously moved by rail because the roads were unavailable. So the scale of the repair work was outstanding and staggering. And the speed with which we returned service to the line was absolutely impressive. Just a quick look at the impact on the traffic flows as a result of this. You can see that, through that 3-week period when the line was out, nearly 54,000 carloads, there was a reduction of that size, that magnitude as a result of the outage. But again, what's amazing to me is that the speed with which the CN engineering team was able to restore that extensive amount of damage in such a short period of time, that within 3 weeks we were back up and running tonnage in the canyon. A quick view of the Port of Vancouver weekly grain hopper car unloads. So obviously that prior year running in the sort of the 7,000 carloads per week range, the loss of the main artery had a dramatic impact on the unloads at the port, which obviously then pushes kind of the issues back into the country because we don't have empty equipment available for the next load. Now, as I said, CP did lose their main line, but they were up and running within about a week. And so we were able to coordinate with them to be able to use their line. So that's why you can see some lift early on before our main line was fully restored, that we were able to run some traffic into the Lower Mainland. And so interestingly, this is the Prince Rupert perspective of the same period of time. And this just demonstrates the inherent resiliency of the CN network, where when Vancouver was out, we did have the opportunity to provide our customers an outlet through Prince Rupert. And so just to kind of wrap up then today, spend a minute and we'll look at one particular section of outage in the Fraser Canyon on the Ashcroft sub, where rather than just applying the same solution as what had been there before, looking at it through the lens of resiliency and keeping in mind that these events could and probably will happen again in the future. How do we build with that in mind? So this is the Ashcroft sub, mile 110.5. So in this location, there was snowpack melting at the top of a 6,000-foot high mountain. And the water equivalent of the snow melt was even more than the rain that was falling. And during the atmospheric river event, some locations received more than a month's worth of rain. So, when you add those two together, really, you're kind of getting 3 months worth of water equivalent in this location. Now, at this location, there's also a 4-tiered waterfall. And so there's a certain amount of water that's flowing through there year-round, no matter what. But then when you think of the physical forces associated with the water flow from the snow melt and the rainfall and the acceleration of that water from 6,000 feet up the mountain, you can appreciate that the water flow can do a lot of damage. And this picture really kind of demonstrates the degree to which that water can just move soil and change the landscape. It completely overwhelmed the culvert. So previous to the event, there was a culvert that would allow for that constant flow from the waterfall to pass through. That day, the water coming off the mountain just overwhelmed the culvert, as you can see, and just completely eroded the side of the mountain there. So given the location and the severity of the surrounding topography, replacing a like for like, so just replacing culvert with a culvert would be insufficient in future extreme weather events. So we needed a more robust and hardened solution. And so CN Engineering, evaluating all of these conditions, decided that a fixed span bridge would be far more resilient during future extreme rain events. In this case, it was a 229-foot rail bridge. So to restore service and prepare the site, the engineering team, they laid temporary track and they reprofiled the slope above the track in order to minimize the risk of debris and runoff. They widened the ditches to capture the runoff from the mountainside and divert it away from the track. Water flow was realigned between the mountain and the track, and the rail embankment was hardened to minimize embankment saturation. The engineering team also reinforced the ballast along the shoulder of the rail bed so that it was as solid as possible. And the track was inspected every time a train passed over the affected area. And we had a rail resurfacing crew on standby as we ran over that temporary track. Now, you need also to do some earthwork in advance where the bridge would be installed so that the 275 and 500-ton cranes that would be used to put the bridge in place would have somewhere solid to sit. We also needed to install supports that would hold the bridge. We had to build the abutments on either side where the bridge was to be built and build piers to support each of the 5 spans. And so we drove piles into the ground first for the pier, braced them, and then added pre-cast concrete caps. So we had to install supports to hold up the bridge and install the new bridge spans. Now here it's 2 107-foot girders that were brought in by rail and assembled into the main span, along with 4 concrete deck spans, 30 feet long each. And then we assembled the bridge span on top of the girders. And obviously this is all happening within an operating environment where we are running tracks on that temporary trains on that temporary track. So we had to coordinate for track time. So we had to implement work blocks and allow a set number of hours for the engineering team to do its work safely. But then finally, not even 2 months after the event, we were able to cut over and put that new bridge into service. And this is just a view from the bottom. You can still see the degree of erosion beneath and how that bridge is now much better suited for this environment where there will continue to be water flow from the waterfall above, but allows for larger rain events, allows for larger snowmelt events. So again, thank you all very much for your time. Key to remember is that this is a capital intensive industry. At CN we are committed to investing in the business, and certainly, as we experience more of these events, the design and construction crews on the engineering side more and more are looking at our infrastructure through this lens of ensuring long-term operational resiliency.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was very interesting, particularly that last section about the construction of that new bridge within the 2 months after the rain events in early November. You sometimes talk about going from feast to famine. We're going to go to floods to drought now. And with our next speaker, Richard Henderson. In early November, the New York Times ran this story. As drought drops water level in the Mississippi, shipwrecks surface and worries rise. The river, known for its vast reach and powerful currents, has withered to levels not seen in decades, choking shipping lines and endangering drinking water supplies. Now, as drought-related disruptions continue on US inland waterways, including the Mississippi, we're very fortunate to have on our program today our next speaker, Rich Henderson, an economist who has for the past year specialized in barge transportation of grain at the Transportation Services Division of the Agricultural Marketing Service of the US Department of Agriculture, or USDA AMS for short. And during my career, the weekly grain transportation report was required reading around our place to follow the developments in the US industry, and including the barge lanes on the Mississippi. Rich's main responsibilities at USDA include providing analysis and economic insight on a variety of barge transportation issues, and supporting the preparation and dissemination of transportation market reports, including for the USDA AMS's grain transportation report. Prior to working at USDA, Rich was an analyst at the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Global Food Research Program. And Rich was also previously an economist at the US Department of Labor with the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Employee Benefits Security Administration. So Rich, welcome. You're coming to us, I think, from the DC area, so you may be a rival for with one of our other speakers as the most distant to connect in today for our presenters. There's certainly a great deal of interest these days in what's happening and what may yet happen on the Mississippi, and what it means for grain markets and generally for transportation markets. So we welcome you to hear more from you on your topic of the US inland waterways and the impact of low water conditions on US agriculture. Over to you, Rich.
Thank you for the introduction, Hedley. I actually think I'm probably farther away because I am actually still in North Carolina. So I am not in DC, and thank you, Barry, for having me. So let me share my screen and make sure that can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. All right. So as Hedley said, I'm going to talk about the inland waterways and the impact that the low water conditions have had on agriculture. Just a little bit of background on the division I work in. We provide economic analysis, market reporting, data, regulatory representation, research and stakeholder outreach, and support for agricultural shipping. And as Hedley mentioned, we do produce a weekly grain transportation report that comes out every Thursday afternoon. Agriculture is important to transportation, and a variety of products moved on the nation's transportation system, such as coal, fuel, and agricultural products. And agriculture and its related industries are the #1 users of freight in the US. And then the percent of modal share for grain movement this is the modal share of grain movement on average from 2012 to 2019. So as you can see, 13% of all grain moves by barge, but 48% of the grain that is exported moves by barge. And most of that moves down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. So I'm going to talk a little bit of background first about barges and the inland waterway system in the US to give you some understanding of the history of it and where we're going now. So in the first half of the 19th century, steam-driven packets were the primary mode of transportation in the central United States. steamboat era ended as railroads began to cross the United States. And in order to stay competitive, packets added barges to the side of the vessels to increase cargo capacity. As a result of this, improvements to the river systems were necessary to allow for safe and dependable movement on the river. In 1878, Congress authorized a 5.4-foot deep channel with canals and locks that allowed boats to bypass rapids and other obstructions. And then in 1907, Congress increased the channel depth to 6 feet. And in 1930, Congress authorized the United States Corps of Engineers to construct and maintain 9-foot deep channel with a minimum width of 400 feet. And currently, the draft is now 12 feet 6 inches in some areas of the river system. So this was the beginning of a massive dam building program that built 29 locks on the upper portion of the Mississippi River and 8 locks on the Illinois River system. The lock farthest down the river on the Mississippi is by St. Louis, and there are no locks between St. Louis, Missouri and New Orleans, Louisiana. There are also 4 locks on the Columbia Snake River in the Pacific Northwest. The original purpose of the federal involvement was to assist in the development of the frontier. Today, the government's role is to help facilitate commercial navigation by providing safe, reliable, cost-effective, and environmentally sustainable waterborne transportation. So just to give you some idea of what a barge looks like, this is a few images of what barges look like. It's basically, I call it floating containers that are tied together and pushed by a tow, or sort of opposite of a tugboat. It pushes it instead of pulling it. And here's a map of the major rivers in the United States. And as I said, the United States Army Corps of Engineers maintains about 12,000 miles of rivers, canals, and other inland and coastal waterways. And as I also said, most of the locks and dams are located on the upper part of the Mississippi River. There are 3 main grain ports in the US. The Mississippi River, which is New Orleans, as you can see in the red, and then the Texas Gulf, which you can see with with the green ports, and then the Pacific Northwest with the yellow ports. This map shows the commodity flows on the major rivers in the United States. The Mississippi River system is the primary waterway for moving agricultural products by barge. And it's essentially important for transporting bulk grains and oil seeds from the Midwest to exports in the New Orleans region. Just to give you some idea of how much of commodities move on the inland waterways, is this slide shows the total number of million short tons of commodities that moved along the inland waterways in the US from 1981 to 2020. The dark blue line is total, the red line is foreign, and the light blue line is domestic. And then to give you some idea of what commodities move, this chart shows the type of commodities moved by the inland waterway system. Petroleum and petroleum products make up the largest percentage. Though food and farm products make up about 12% of barge tonnage over the same time period. And just to give you some idea of a comparison between each of the different types of transportation modes and how much they can move. So if you look at the comparison between barge, truck, and rail, a typical 15 barge tow can move over 26,000 tons, or almost 875,000 bushels. A 108-car train can move almost 12,000 tons, or 400,000 bushels, and one large semi-truck can move 25 tons, or 912 bushels. So what does a barge tow look like? So a typical barge tow will be 3 across and 5 long, so it would be 15. There are larger tows though. One issue with the larger tow is that some of the locks and dams that were built are not able to handle the width of anything over 3 barges across. So what they'll have to do is break the barges apart, and they'll have to push half of the or a quarter of the barges through, then go back through the lock or the dam, and then push the other part through. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that our locks and dams are approximately 50 years old, and a lot of them are in the process of being upgraded and expanded so that they can fit the larger tows that we're seeing now, as opposed to the ones that we're seeing back 50 years ago. So what's been going on in the US? So this is the current drought monitor for the US. And this came out on December 6th. And as you can see, a lot of the US is in drought. And the middle of the US has been in serious drought since the beginning of the summer. And unfortunately, this is a 8 to 14 day precipitation outlook for December 21st to December 27th. And right now, the forecast is for below normal precipitation. So the issue that's going on right now may only be exacerbated by the lack of rain that's happening. Some of the issues of the drought, one of the major things that happened to the drought was the low water levels on the Mississippi. And one of the, on October 18th, the Mississippi River water gauge at Memphis reached an all-time low of negative 10.8 feet. A negative number does not mean that it's below sea level or the river has run dry. It just means that the gauge reading is at or below agreed upon zero level. A gauge zero level is chosen considering meta factors such as a reference point or historical levels. So a negative 10 feet does not mean that that's below sea level or it's gone dry. And that's something I want to make sure that everybody understands, because that seems to be a point of confusion at times when they mention water gauge levels. It's at a reference point that has been agreed upon previously. And while there has been some rain, and currently I'm sure we are experiencing a storm that has come through the entire United States and has dropped a lot of rain. So it has improved some portions of the river system. But unless more rain continues to come, low levels will continue to be an issue on in our inland waterways, especially the Mississippi River. So what has this low water level caused in terms of barge capacity, or what's able to move? So beginning in July, water levels started to be below what was the 5-year average, and they continued to fall through November. And just recently in certain places, they've started to rebound. So what does all this mean? So barge companies had to use lighter loads with less barges and smaller draft sizes. And so for example, where they might normally push 25 barge or 30 to 40 barges, they're only able to push 25 barges now. So there's a reduction of 17 to 28%. And then on October 17th, industry agreed to reduce drafts to 9 feet. So draft is how deep the boat can go. And so that would be a 24 to 30% reduction in the tons of barges, tonnage per barge that was be able to move down the river. And while water levels on some portions of the Mississippi River have seen some rain, water gauges have increased, allowing for larger drafts at various times. Right now, the big area that is an issue is between St. Louis, Missouri, and Cairo, Illinois. And one of the issues there is a reduction in flows of a reservoir at Gavin's Point Dam on the Missouri River. And it's been reduced to what they're calling winter flows. There are several reservoirs along the Mississippi River system that hold water that can be released to try to maintain a consistent water level. And one of the major ones that feeds into that portion of the Mississippi River, it comes from the Missouri River. And unfortunately, based on a law, it has to be reduced to the winter levels towards the end of November. And though there was some talk about being able to, have that keep going and not reducing it, unfortunately, it actually takes an act of Congress in order for that to not take place. So that was unable to happen. So there was a reduction in flow that will unfortunately continue to cause the area between Cairo, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri to be an issue unless there is more precipitation. And just to give you an idea of that, what the drought and what's happened is in that reservoir, come spring, when usually after the snowpack melts and it fills up, they're still expecting that reservoir to be 12 to 15 feet below what it normally is. So this may be an issue that continues into the spring based on what's been going on with the drought for so long. One good piece of news that we've had just this past week is that south of Cairo, Illinois, drafts have been able to go back to what they would call normal, which is 12 feet, 6 inches. Unfortunately, over the last few weeks in that portion of the river, there's been severe fog issues. And so that has slowed barges down as well. So just, we talked about this before, but just to give you some other idea about barge capacity at different draft sizes. So going from 12 foot, 6 inches draft size to a 9 foot draft size reduced capacity by about 33%. And so as a result of the low water and these capacity constraints, one of the things that the things that we really noticed to happen starting early in September and then really peaked in November was the spot rates for barges started to increase to levels not seen before. And in this graph, the green bar represents the weekly rate for 2022. The red line is the 2021 rate, and the blue line is the 5-year average for 2017 to 2021. And as you can see, the spot rate started above average early in the year, and then sort of, towards the beginning of summer went back to average. And then when the issues on the river system started to happen in late September and October, the spot rate started to increase. And at St. Louis, it reached $105.85 per ton the week of October 11th. And that was an all-time high for St. Louis. And in fact, I think every single one of the freight rates that week reached all-time highs. It has since come back down. And as of December 6th, it's the lowest it's been since September, but it's still 77% higher than it was last year and 139% higher than the 3-year average. So what's causing these rates to be high? And currently there's little demand as farmers have plenty of cash and no reason to sell at this point. Exports have continued at a slow pace, especially corn, and supply is tight on the river with the conditions. So a lot of barge companies aren't willing to sell space on their barge beyond what their commitments already were. So whatever they had contracts for. So that caused prices to go up. With the conditions on the river unpredictable, shippers have been holding off until the situation gets better. And one thing that we saw, especially in October, is there was a lot of grain sitting in elevators, either because shippers are waiting to ship until rates are lower and conditions are better, or because the water level was so low that barges couldn't get to the grain elevators in order to fill up. And another thing that happened with the the restrictions and the low water levels is that there were instances where barges that were already on their way down the river got stuck. They got grounded. They were too heavy. They couldn't make it through the river. And so that was another reason that barge companies were selling less space on barges, because they didn't want to have instances where more barges got stuck. So not only have the spot rate gone up and reached all-time high levels, so has the forward rate. So if I can't buy a barge today, can I buy it next month or sometime in the future? And those rates have also increased. So just to give you some example, so this is the 1 month barge freight rate for St. Louis. So again, barge rates have been above average most of the year. And again, the green bar is the weekly 2022 rate. The red line is the 2021 rate, and the blue line is the 5-year average. And as you can see in October, it also reached all-time high levels. So the 1 month rate in October would be for a barge sometime in November. And again, it's come down, but it's still 85% higher than it was last year. And then we also measure the 3 month out rate. And again, this has been much higher all year long than it has been on average. And it peaked in October as well. And it's come down, but it's still 82% higher than it was at this time last year. And one of the other issues that the low water has had is how easily barges can move along the system, getting from point A to point B. And as I said, some barges have been grounded. And so one measure of how freely barges can move about the system would be the number of grain barges unloaded in New Orleans. And in fact, when I speak to barge companies, that's usually the first question they ask me is how many barges have been unloaded in New Orleans last week? So that gives them some idea of how things are doing on the river and how things are moving. Again, the green bar is 2022, the red line is 2021, and the blue line is the average. And one thing to keep in mind with this graph is in 2021, at the end of August, Hurricane Ida hit. So the river was essentially closed for a few weeks. So there was no barges moving down. But as you can see, since October, with the exception of a few months, the number of grain barges unloaded has been below average. So you've got smaller and lighter tows and slower moving barges dealing with delays, continue to lower the number of barges unloaded. And luckily, it has sort of picked up as water levels, especially in the lower portion of the Mississippi River, has increased, but still not back to normal. So what does all of this mean? And so what we've done is we put together some what I call back of the envelope calculations to give people some idea of what the economic impact of this possibly could be. So if you given the 5-year average of grain moving down the system from September to December, which is when the issues started happening late September, of 13.1 tons of grain, and you look at a 24 to 30% reduction of tonnage due to the restrictions, then only 9.2 to 10 million tons of grain may move down the river. And another thing to keep in mind is that this is a critical period for soybeans, as 47% of all soybeans move down the river during this time period. So given the 5-year average of almost 6.9 million tons of soybeans that move down the river during this time period, and again, the 24 to 30% reduction, only about 4.9 million tons to 5.3 million tons of soybeans may move down the river. So that's one issue. The other issue is that there's been lower grain inspections out of the Mississippi Gulf since August. For August through October, grain inspections were 24% below the 2018 to 2020 average. And soybean inspections were down 27%, and corn inspections were down 29%. Fortunately, grain inspections out of the Gulf have increased in the recent weeks, reaching almost normal levels the week of October 20th. However, for the week ending December 8th, inspections were down 17% from the previous week and 13% from average. So there's a lot of, it gets better and then it doesn't, it goes back to being an issue that's been happening with the low water on the Gulf. And the other issues that we've seen are higher prices coming out of the Gulf. So this chart looks at corn prices over time at a few different locations. So Portland would be red, the Louisiana Gulf is blue, and those are terminal prices. And then orange, green, and purple lines are inland or origin corn prices. And the wide divergence between the Gulf and inland prices reflects the low water issues on the Mississippi River, which led to higher transportation costs and higher prices of US grain exports out of the Gulf. In recent weeks, the narrowing spread between the Gulf and inland prices is a sign of the disruptions easing a little bit over the last month. The other issue that we saw was that the amount of grain moving southbound on barges has decreased this year. So again, the green bar is 2022, the red line is 2021, and the blue line is the 5-year average. And just a reminder again that the red line is broken due to Hurricane Ida that hit last year. So for most of 2022, down barn grain has been close to or above average until late August, where we started seeing less grain move south via barge, which corresponded to the low water and the restrictions that were put on barges. So as of December 3rd, 30.1 million tons of grain have moved downbound through the locks of the Mississippi River year to that point through the year. So it would be 15.5 million tons of corn, 1.5 million tons of wheat, and 12.9 million tons of soybeans. And just to give you an idea, this is a drop of 11% of the amount of grain moving through the locks this year compared to last year. And last year we had Hurricane Ida, and so a portion of the river were closed for several weeks, sorry, not 7 weeks. And just another statistic is that corn is down 30%, wheat is down 3%, but soybeans are up 31% from last year. So to put all this together, it's been a challenging year for agricultural transportation. The historical low water levels, the reduced capacity, high rates, low Gulf export volumes. The other issue we've had is poor rail service. That's been an issue in the US for a while. And we had the possibility of rail strikes in September and then again earlier this month. High forward rates suggest that there are lingering issues. So as I said, with the reservoir in the Mississippi River is expected to be below normal, trying to get the water levels at the Mississippi River back to where they normally are is going to take a long time. An interesting fact, in talking to a couple of barge companies, they were actually hoping in late fall that a hurricane would hit, because if a hurricane hit, then there would be more water in the Mississippi River area. So not something you hear every day. We've also experienced lower, like I said, lower than normal downbound grain. So that is it. And
well, thank you very much, Rich. A very interesting presentation for we in the prairies here. We're looking outside right now. We're seeing a lot of snow accumulating and a lot of frozen ice on our rivers. It's not, the barge system doesn't seem to be a local factor here, but it's an important, you can see just how important it is to the US ag sector. And just I'll remind everyone that if you have questions to pose to our presenters here, submit them into the meeting chat room there. I'll continue to monitor those and pose some of them to our questions, queue them up here. But just let me open with if we could bring back our other presenter onto the screen here. Greg, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Let me just open up with a question to Rich. What's fascinating, do you think, from a Canadian standpoint, is to see the price visibility. You talked about the volume impacts here, which are clearly reported, but the price impact you're seeing in the final slides that you put up there, some very significant changes in relative pricing of, let's say, barge freight versus rail freight. And also in that, near the end of your presentation, you also were showing, I think it was it for corn or for wheat? It was
for corn, yeah.
Corn prices in the PNW versus the US Gulf. Just if you could step back and just describe for our audience in Canada here, what's the normal spread, barge, or the spread in prices between the PNW and the Gulf? You'd see a discount in prices out of the Gulf versus the PNW, and it seemed to be fairly flat this fall. Is that correct?
I believe so. I'll be honest with you, that's not my area of expertise, and it's I don't want to speak on something that I'm not sure about, but I believe you are correct. I mean, the spread is usually the price coming out of the Gulf would be a little bit less than going out of the Pacific Northwest, and you didn't see that as much this year, though. As you can, especially sorry, I'm just looking at the graph, especially as you look at October when the low water levels hit, the price of the Gulf went up compared to the Pacific Northwest, and that's come back down. So yeah, it's definitely, it was unusual. I mean, the low water definitely had an impact on prices that we probably hadn't seen since, my understanding is 2012, when we had the last issue on the low water levels in the Mississippi.
That's right. I think that what it does is that if a grain trader is sitting, let's say in Japan or in China, looking to buy US grain, they're going to be looking for the lowest price. And so quite often it's in the US Gulf. So they have an incentive to put on a vessel to go through the Panama Canal, perhaps to go into the Pacific Rim. But when this price gap narrows, that Gulf advantage is lost, and therefore the pull starts shifting to the Pacific Northwest, and which I guess coincides with the peak period of exports for, let's say, the US rail carriers like Burlington Northern or Union Pacific or even CP going through the PNW. They're already handling their normal peak period, and so this is going to add another workload for them to try to fulfill some of this export demand.
I do know that there was actually some talk about, especially with soybeans, trying to move them north through the St. Louis Seaway. I mean, there was some talk of, because at some point it was so bad getting south that maybe they would go north and then be able to export from there as well.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Another one, just if I could bring you, I don't know if you can bring up your map again, but can you position where Cairo is, Cairo, Illinois, on the map, and just refer to that, just to familiarize our Canadian audience to.
Sure. Let me pull up the map, share my screen really quick. So let me pull up the, so Cairo, Illinois is sort of where the Missouri River, the Ohio River meet.
And
That would be, it would be about around here.
I'm not seeing it on my screen, but it's where the confluence comes together. And you were distinguishing between the upper Mississippi and the lower Mississippi. Is Cairo kind of the dividing points, or?
Yeah, Cairo and St. Louis usually are what they consider the dividing point. Oh, I didn't share my screen. I apologize. There, can you see it now?
That's better. Yeah, great.
Okay, sorry about that. So it's about here on the, so the lower Mississippi River would be here. So anything south of St. Louis is usually considered the lower Mississippi. And then anything up would be the upper Mississippi.
And it seasonally closes, the upper Mississippi closes down, I understand.
Right, so the upper Mississippi, they don't accept, barges don't move, because in fact, just this week, we've heard that there's actually some ice starting on the Illinois River here. So that that's going to start being an issue. But yeah, because of the ice and the freezing, they can't move the barges through the river on the upper portion of the Mississippi.
That's great. And then finally, just you commented on Missouri, that they're also, I guess, with the water that does flow into the watershed of the Missouri, there are competing demands for that water. It's not just going to flow downstream all year round in order to support barge freight on the Mississippi. What are the issues there? What on the reservoirs?
My understanding is that there are 8 uses for that reservoir in particular, and it has to be kept at a certain level. And so they reduce the flows during the winter when there's less water. So my understanding is that this time of the year, there's usually the time when the water levels drop throughout the system. And it happened earlier, and then the drought exacerbated the issues. But they hold water in that reservoir, and there are several reservoirs throughout the river system that allow for them to open up and sort of like, once, if it drops too low, they can add water to it. But that particular reservoir at Gavin's Dam has 8 specific uses that need to be used throughout the years. What they are, I honestly do not know. But as a result, they couldn't just shut off the flow from that reservoir. It would have taken an act of Congress in order to do that. And if you know anything about our Congress right now, trying to get anything done like that would be very difficult. So there was no way that they could do it. But there was several barge companies and several other people, that was questions they asked, like, can we just not turn it off? And then that area will not be such an issue. But unfortunately, there was no way that they could do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just turn to our other presenter here. You both of you seem like you've been to the same barber, and you look like you could be are well suited to this presentation, or the same panel here today. Greg, I don't.
Well, Hedley, it's always a pleasure to present alongside other handsome men such as Richard. So.
Just the last question, or the last part of your presentation with the bridge replacement is triggered a question from Mitch Rezanoff, talking about the vintage of the infrastructure. He's pointing out that CN's line, I guess, or CP's line, even through the canyon, is more than a century old. Right. What is the age of the bridges and spans going through the canyon and that area? And
right, and
has there been an effort to upgrade those over years?
Yeah, no, look, I wouldn't know the specifics of the infrastructure and the age. I do, you're right. I mean, the original track was laid in the late 19th century for CP and the early 20th for Canadian Northern. So, the original infrastructure would be over 100 years old, but But as you can appreciate, we have this constant, as I said, 60% of our capital spend is for basic maintenance, and that will be addressing, rails, ties, ballast, but also some of the underlying structures as well. We typically won't replace a structure until it reaches the end of life. So I don't know how many of those structures in the Fraser Canyon in particular would be either original or having been replaced at some point over the last century or the last 50 years. In the case of that Ashcroft Mile 110, though, I think it's a good example of, assessing the evolving needs of the infrastructure in its environment. And as the environment around the infrastructure shifts and evolves and changes, as a result of climate change or other issues, addressing those needs as they come up. So, I don't think we're approaching this from a point of view of doing a full bridge rehabilitation change out in advance of the need, but certainly as the need arises, as the need becomes apparent, we are there and assessing it, as I say, through the lens of resiliency and long-term sustainability.
In this case, and the case at mile 101 of the Ashcroft sub that you were talking about here, this was a replacement of what had been a culvert.
It was a box culvert, which obviously had to be in place because there was the regular runoff from the mountainside. So there would be a constant flow of water, summer, fall, winter. But clearly, given the magnitude of the volume of water that came down the mountain that day, both from the snowmelt and from the rain event, it moved a lot of earth out of the way, but obviously, brought about the thinking that this is an event that has happened and could likely happen again in that location. So doing a like for like was not an appropriate solution. So to just put in another culvert in that location was not necessarily looking at it through a long-term lens. It probably cost more capital to put the bridge in place in the short run. But if you look at it through the lens even of 20, 30, 50 years, over that time horizon, it would be less expensive to do that replacement as a bridge.
And Rich, let me, another question for you. This is a little bit of a different one. If you've been emphasizing the impact on the downstream, the downstream flow, which will be perhaps dominated by agricultural products, Mitch has asked another question here about the impact on the upstream traffic, and he was suggesting, would it be on fertilizer, urea, and so on, or what other traffic categories are you aware of that have been affected by this?
Yeah, so anything that moved by barge on the rivers, and it was both north and southbound, and I know that at one point it was, especially in October when things were really bad, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was sort of putting priority on southbound barges, because they have to get, the empty barges are the ones that move up. So they were trying to get them down in order to move up. But fertilizer and the urea is moving up as well. And my understanding is that at some point there was some concern that farmers were not going to get the fertilizer that they need, but that doesn't seem to have taken place.
Can I follow on with you, Rich? Another question. You mentioned that the locks in some cases are being expanded, and I know that for many years there's been a concern about the barge system in the U.S. not receiving funding for renewal or maintenance even of the existing infrastructure. Can you characterize what the approved programs have been, what their nature are? Are they intended to harden the system for or deal with the capacity expansion? What's the character of the programs?
You sort of get two general. You get the maintenance of the current locks and dams on the river, and then there's the expansion of it. And up in the upper portion of the Mississippi River. They just received funding, and it's a long process. It's not something that happens. It's a multi-year, like 5 to 10 year project in order to improve or expand the locks. So they go through these they get funding for different various portions of it. And I know there's one lock on the upper Mississippi River that has received the funding in order for the design, and that's been finished. And then they have to put out bids in order for to expand it. So they're expanding it from 600-foot wide to 1,200-foot wide, so that you can have barge traffic in both directions. But that's unfortunately the way the government funds projects, is it's funded on a yearly basis. So each year that has to be funded, and whether it can go forward or not depends on whether there's funding for that particular project or not.
Rich, or I should say, Greg, just you've taken on a new role in investor relations, and can you just maybe describe for the audience here how the investment community, how they were viewing the events of the last year or year and a half, these extreme weather events, and the kind of questions that you were being asked as to it might have been relating to the recovery or the state of preparedness or the resilience. What are their concerns and more generally about this?
Hedley, I'd say, a couple of different responses depending on the location of the shareholder. A lot of North American-based shareholders, very interested in the recovery effort, the length of the outage, and our ability to recover and continue to move that traffic. So very operational focused, as you can expect. From our European shareholder base, though, they tend to look at things through much more of an ESG and sustainability lens. So that's where I think we got a little more interest in terms of, what is the nature of your infrastructure, and how resilient is it? How much ability do you have to withstand events like this as they are likely to occur more frequently in the future? So, different perspectives. I think, the European shareholder base tends to take a bit more of a longer lens view and look at it through, the cause, what brought these events to bear, and then what is the longer term impact to the company, and how are you prepared in addressing that risk? Yes.
Barry, our time is up on this panel, if I'm not mistaken. Would you perhaps be interested in intervening at this point here and giving us some guidance on the next steps?
Well, thank you very much, Hedley, and thank you also, Rich and Greg, for some great presentations. Certainly, I feel like I learned a lot, and the one thing that struck me, Greg, is the speed with which the railway responded, and how do you do that? Like, do you have a task force that's ready to leap into action at any point in time, and what sort of lag time is there to do things?
Well, the reality is, Barry, with the size of our annual capital program, effectively CN has a construction company as part of our regular operations. So we have, very highly skilled, very dedicated, very capable people in the engineering team, and they're addressing, episodic issues across the network on a daily basis. And when we have an event of this magnitude, it's about bringing all those resources to bear at the same time. So it's through our employees, our relationship with our contractors, that, in 3 short weeks, we're able to restore that corridor, which is, to your point, it's incredible.
It was, to me, it was miraculous. I thought months and months was going to be required. So congratulations to you and to CP as well for getting your network back together, which I guess is more important because one of you are running one way and the other. So both had to come into play to open up.
Absolutely. It's a shared destiny in the Fraser Canyon, and leveraging the benefits of that DRZ agreement is really to the benefit of both companies, to our customers, our shareholders, and ultimately to the Canadian economy.
Yeah, well, thank you very much again, and to the panel, thank you so much. Everyone, we're going to reconvene at 12:20. We are going to have a really interesting speaker talking about what are the macroeconomic effects and disruptions. To what degree do these rising interest rates and inflation and other prices of energy and so on, how do they impact the supply chain, and what's the implication for that? So please check back in, and thank you very much to everyone for your participation. We'll see you soon.